You're listening to the Talking Headways podcast network.
This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Ben Donsky of Agora Partners to discuss City Walk Birmingham in Alabama, a public space project that connects two sides of the city separated by a highway. We chat about positive public space and what it takes to make a project like this happen. Stay with us.
Today's podcast is brought to you by our super wonderful, terrific, amazing Patreon supporters. We appreciate you all keeping this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire going. To join this merry band of city wizards and transportation experts, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note sent with a cool train station stamp. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. We've also got some bonus material up there, so check it out if you haven't already. And speaking of scarves, the heavyweight net bike scarf is back in stock. I'm also going to make a concerted effort to make some new designs, but if you want to get one of the Buster Bike scarves or the Lightweight Bike scarf now, visit theoverheadwire.com or support us on Patreon. And if you'd like to support the show in other ways, you can buy books at the bookshop site, bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire, or find our Cars Are Cholesterol merch at bit.ly/carsarecholesterol. For anything else, including the Town Planning and Practice audiobook, visit theoverheadwire.com and definitely sign up for the almost 20-year-old daily newsletter. Or you can just keep listening and enjoying the show. We appreciate that too. You can also find us on Blue Sky, Mastodon, Threads, Instagram, Flickr, YouTube, Substack, and LinkedIn if you want to connect, usually at the Overhead Wire, but with Flickr, it's Transit Nerds. Some great stuff coming up, so keep on listening and enjoy the show. A quick note for Patreon supporters. I've set up an ad-free podcast RSS feed at Patreon. This means if you want to listen to the show without ads or promotional episodes in your podcatcher of choice, you can do so by heading over to your Patreon account and getting the feed there. I'll post instructions in the show notes of how to do it. And if you aren't a Patreon supporter, you can do so by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Even just $1 a month gets you our podcast free of outside ads. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Ben Donsky, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks for being here. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm an urban planner. I have been practicing for about 22 years. And you know what they say, practice makes, well...
A planner?
A planner, exactly. And my work has really focused on public spaces and helping my clients, so all kinds of different entities, government, foundations, as well as a variety of different types of private sector entities, how to develop what are called high performing public spaces. So meaning public spaces that really aim to meet the needs and desires of surrounding communities. I'm based in New York City. I have lived in New York longer than I have lived anywhere else, 20 plus years. But I grew up all over the country and I work all over the country, grew up in rural and suburban and urban environments, and to get to continue visiting all those different types of places in the work that I do, which is very lucky.
Do you find that background and experience helps you kind of navigate some of the, not the politics, but the different folks who might be interested in different things when you're talking about public space?
Yeah, I think being able to go into situations and listen and ask questions is extremely important because, you know, it's the same types of skills that help you as a kid move to a new city or town and learn about the local culture. You know, it's a lot of the same types of skills that I use today. And I think I also developed a kind of curiosity about the differences between these places when I was growing up. And so now, you know, I get to really explore those things. So I think there's definitely a connection.
Do you feel like a little bit of a shapeshifter sometimes? Like I do. My family, my mom grew up here in San Francisco, where I am now. And then I grew up in Texas, in Houston. And then so if I'm here in San Francisco, I'm a multi-generational San Franciscan. But if I'm in Houston, I was born in Humble, Texas. So it's like wherever I go, I can fit in a little bit and not be yelled at for being in California and Texas or not being a Texan in California.
So as a teenager, I moved from the Orlando, Florida area to San Francisco, which is a pretty shocking
That's a pretty different experience, right?
Yeah, we could talk more about San Francisco offline, but yeah, I think that was a really formative experience. And then going from, an inner city public high school, then to an elite private college was another kind of big shift. So I think, yeah, being able to talk to different types of people is extremely important. I don't love the term shapeshifter.
It came to my head. An understanding of many different people and places.
Yeah, getting an understanding of all those people, but I also think there's something very critical about, not changing who you are depending on the context, because I think being honest and open and sincere with people is such an important part of placemaking and such an important part of, community-based economic development and place-based economic development. And people can tell when you are faking it.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. I guess I should clarify on my end. Like, when I would go to public meetings here in San Francisco for bus rapid transit or something along those lines, and there's a lot of nativist folks, right? There's a lot of folks who won't listen to you or even listen to where you're coming from if you tell them that you're from another place. They're like, oh, you're from outside. And so I feel like that's kind of like the tough spot that a lot of planners are in when they come into places in cities.
Oh, totally.
And come in and people are like, well, you're not from here, so you don't understand. And so,
I always tell people wherever city I go, I am never going to be more of an expert in your community than you are, right? I don't live there. I don't work there. I am visiting there on occasion. That's not my job. My job is not to become an expert and know everything about your community. My job is to figure out how to translate techniques, principles, methods that have been successful in other places, in other contexts, figuring out how to apply those to your specific context to meet your specific goals. And so the answers from project to project, the recommendations are always changing, right? Everything is going to be unique to a specific community. But a lot of those methods and techniques and ways of thinking about public space, ways of thinking about developing, activating, and managing public spaces, those translate. And what we can do is help empower people in their communities and build capacity in those communities so they can, leverage all of those methods and tools to create great places.
Yeah. It's funny. I've heard other folks say that they're never more of an expert than when they're from out of town because they go for bids in their own town and they never get them. But then if they go to other towns, they do because people like the outside expertise. It's a funny back and forth.
Yeah, there's definitely an element of that, right? I also think there is some advantage to, being removed from a situation of not having all of the baggage that accompanies some of these projects. But that's not the same in my mind as expertise in their community, right?
Sure. Yeah. I want to go back in time a little bit. Like when you were a little kid, were you always interested in cities and planning and urban issues?
I started when I was probably a kid. I started looking at New York City transit maps. And whenever we would visit New York, I had an older brother who moved here when I was about 8. So that's probably when I started to fall in love with New York and started to fall in love with cities. And I loved the idea of this complex transit system that had all these moving pieces. But I think it was really a couple of things. Moving to San Francisco and then, being put in the middle of a gentrifying neighborhood, right? Being kind of part of the first wave of gentrification of part of Noe Valley, further up Dolores Street, like up what they call like Upper Noe Valley now.
That's where I am.
So you know it. Well, I grew up partially on 27th and Dolores in the mid 90s during the transition. It was already always a safe place, but being part of that gentrification and then again, learning the transit system backwards and forwards and just falling in love with that. And then strangely, seeing the movie Roger and Me, which has all happened around the same time. I was probably about 15 years old. And there's this section in the movie Roger and Me, which has made a huge impression about festival marketplaces. And when they put the Auto World in Flint and it failed. And then there was also Michael Moore did another TV show, TV Nation, I think, and he compared two aquariums in it. One was downtown Camden and the other was downtown Chattanooga. And I just found this type of stuff fascinating. And so I started to get really interested in downtown redevelopment as a teenager. So I've been interested in cities probably since I was about 8 or 9 years old.
I love it. I love hearing people's stories about how they get into this stuff too. We talk about this all the time on the show, but like everybody comes at it from a circuitous, direction, becoming a city planner or becoming a geographer or whatever somebody may be. But, folks out there listening that might not feel like they have a route to being or doing something that they love, they actually do, because there's so many different ways. And so I ask people about their childhoods a lot. All right. I want to talk with you about Birmingham. You've been working on this project in Birmingham, creating public space under a highway. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how this project came about and some of the details, maybe of the city and the highway itself.
Sure. So to be clear, I started working on this personally when I was at my previous firm. This would have been in early 2016 was when I was first involved. And we wrapped up our work. We're not currently working on City Walk Birmingham. Our last work for them finished, I believe, in about 2 years ago. But I was involved, off and on for about 7.5 years, from the initial conception and planning of the project all the way through its operation. So the project actually emerged as a compromise between Alabama DOT and a variety of different community members, some of whom had organized themselves into a nonprofit group that was attempting to stop a highway reconstruction project. This highway, when it was originally built in Birmingham, this is Highway Interstate 59 and Interstate 20, they come together. If you look at an aerial photo of where this highway goes, you will notice a curious bend right at the location of City Walk. That bend in the highway route is a result of highway planners, when this was originally built, intentionally destroying the neighborhood where all of the civil rights leaders in Birmingham were living. So I think it's really, really important to start with the idea that there had been a thriving Black neighborhood. This neighborhood was destroyed intentionally to build a highway and, possibly, I'm sure they hoped, interfere with the civil rights movement. So when it was time for Alabama DOT to reconstruct this highway because its useful life had expired, this, was obviously going to be very controversial. I would have thought, if I were at Alabama DOT, I would have said, oh yeah, this is going to be a really controversial project. We should get out in front of that. But they didn't. And I was actually brought in on the recommendation of a lighting designer, because this was a highway project. And so the designer who was doing all the lighting for the highway, as well as regular highway lighting, as well as architectural and decorative lighting, I had previously worked with on several projects, including a couple in Newark, New Jersey. And, he basically pitched me to Alabama Department of Transportation as a white guy who was going to be comfortable talking to all of the Black constituents that they were not comfortable talking to. And my first work on the project was essentially to go in and figure out, is there a viable program? Is there a feasible program for a public space underneath a highway that could actually engage the community and be, desired, valued? Could it meet some existing needs, open space needs in Birmingham, if we were to put it under a highway? And can we get to a community driven solution for that park? And when I started, obviously, people were extremely skeptical that something like this could work, that it would be a pleasant place to be. And I should note that a lot of community residents really wanted to bury the highway. They wanted to, bury it and cap it, which was funny because one of the projects that they pointed to as a precedent was one that I had been involved with for many years called Clyde Warren Park in Dallas, which I worked on for something like 8 years or something. And I was told, oh, you cannot mention Clyde Warren Park because Alabama DOT will go crazy if you mention that. They're not going to bury the park, not going to cap it. They just don't have the money. And so that was really off the table. And I do believe that burying it was, I don't think it was ever really on the table.
The DOT made it so that it was basically not on the table. Anything's possible.
Yeah, anything is possible, right? But it's like...
But the DOT had probably decided a long time ago that they're not burying the highway or making it into a surface level boulevard.
Well, and the reality is it's elevated on both sides, either side of downtown. So they would have taken an elevated highway, had it go underground, and then have it go elevate again, which, I'm not an engineer. I can imagine that's complicated and expensive. But yeah, anything is possible with money. So, but yeah, DOT was never going to bury it. And in fact, there was probably more skepticism at DOT around the viability of a public space under the project than there was in the community after we did some extensive community engagement. I think over the course of 6 to 8 months, we were able to have a series of meetings with a lot of different constituents, and which really, I was actually surprised that we got to that point, because the first meeting I went to, there was so much bad blood between DOT and different stakeholders, not just the Black community. Really, all of the representatives from neighborhood councils and neighborhood organizations were opposed to the project, very skeptical, had a very, very poor relationship with DOT. And so it took us several workshops to really figure out, okay, this is a venue that maybe can make up for the lack of high quality play facilities and a lack of green space in some other neighborhoods. Like, how can we specifically incorporate play facilities? Was one. A big one was skating facilities. There was no skate park anywhere in Birmingham, and people had to drive to, I think, Tuscaloosa to get to the closest skate park. So we had, the skating community, the BMX community showing up in big numbers, and that was really, really helpful. But we had 31 acres of space, so it really wasn't too challenging to carve out different uses and programs for different spaces, and then, develop a management structure that would allow for all of those great things to happen and allow for third-party organizations in the community to really produce a lot of these events, and with financial support from public agencies.
What's on both sides of the highway? I'm looking at a map of it right now. It looks like downtown, and it looks like a bunch of hotels and basically the convention center.
So the convention center and the adjacent entertainment district was all originally developed as part of this very large urban renewal project, which included the highway.
When they first built the highway.
Correct. So on one side of the highway, it's the convention center. On the other side, it is the historic downtown core, but it's largely institutional uses. There's a jail in one of the buildings. There is the Performing Arts High School for the state of Alabama, which was a really cool thing to have adjacent to the space. But it's largely institutional and government buildings on one side, and then the convention center on the other.
I'm curious about the discussions that you had with the local Black community, with folks who are interested in seeing what would happen with the space. Obviously, the DOT was not really budging on any big changes, but also what got them to change their mind? What was it that got it into their head that this was actually maybe possible?
I think it is really important to remember that individuals in public agencies can sometimes still have a significant impact. And there was a gentleman, the regional engineer for AlDOT, a gentleman named DeJarvis Leonard. I think once he was convinced that this was going to be something that the community would embrace or could embrace, then he wanted to make sure from the DOT side that it was going to happen and that they were going to do everything they could. Did I ever have a formal, extensive, or informal, extensive conversation with him about his personal motivations? Not really. But it was hard to be a part of, multiple rounds of community engagement over multiple years and not be affected emotionally by some of the stories that you heard from people who were senior citizens now, but were children or teenagers when their homes were taken away from them, or even kids, teenagers, young adults today talking about literally not having a place to go do this specific recreational activity. It becomes very obvious. This is a space that is really going to be needed, right? And so I think I cannot really give enough credit to DeJarvis Leonard of him kind of pushing through whatever red tape to make sure that we could put structures underneath a highway, which is hard to do. We're currently working on a highway project in St. Petersburg, Florida. And every one we go through, this is, I think, our fourth one, we have these same conversations with DOT. But, oh, you can't put any permanent structures under there. Well, what do you mean by permanent? And we kind of, come to some resolution, and some negotiation. But I think he really tried to make sure we were going to have the structures and the amenities necessary, permission to do those things from DOT and FHWA to help activate the space and make it valuable. And, I think also the involvement of the Birmingham Jefferson Convention Center Authority was really, really critical. They actually manage and operate the space now. That wasn't originally the plan, but from the very beginning, the convention center, who operates, not just the convention center, but also the arena, stadium, and the entertainment district, they understood that a really successful public space here would be good for them financially. They'd get more visitors, maybe benefit some conventions, but they also understood how projects like this can affect people's perceptions about downtowns and affect people's perceptions about cities. So they understood it from an economic development perspective. So I think they were able to lobby AlDOT from that angle. And so AlDOT was simultaneously hearing from the community and going through a much more extensive and unusual community engagement process for them, because they're typically doing standard check the box public engagement for building highways and maintaining highways. They're not doing the more extensive and more, I'll just say, creative types of engagement that you do when you're developing parks and public spaces. So the combination of that, the economic development arguments that they were hearing, I think it all kind of came together for them, and AlDOT became a supporter.
I do wonder about the results of having people play and recreate under a highway. I know that other highway caps and lids around the country have seen lots of pollution, lots of particulate matter increases. We know that, building apartments near highways in places like Los Angeles and even Oakland are subject to higher concentrations of particulate matter and also higher instances of asthma and other respiratory diseases. So I'm wondering, obviously it's the best thing you could do with what Alabama DOT was doing, but also there's some negative impacts of that overall for a longer term. How do you mitigate that?
Well, so first I would say that if you're choosing between building a park not next to a highway or not under a highway and one under a highway, choose the one that's not next to or under a highway, right? I think that's pretty obvious. but that's not usually the choice that we're facing. So the real question becomes, how do you program and activate the space in light of those potential concerns? Because if the real question is, well, are we going to develop a public space here, or are we just going to let it go to weeds? That's typically the choice, right? Are we going to develop a public space under this highway, or are we going to do nothing? I'd say building the public space is better, right? But yes, absolutely, we need to be cognizant of those issues: air quality, particulate matter. Look, I'm not a scientist. I'm an urban planner, but my understanding is that those issues are very site specific, context specific, that there are probably places where it is more dangerous to do this type of project and places where it is less dangerous to do this type of project. We're probably not going to recommend people doing, an entire marathon underneath a highway, right? But can you do a lower impact 45-minute Tai Chi class? Well, if the sound conditions allow for it, maybe that's okay, right? So it's important to take those things into account. But I think it's also important to remember, like, the choice that we have here is not necessarily, oh, should we build a park someplace else versus under this highway? At least when I'm getting involved, that's not on the table. It's, should we do something under this highway, or should we do nothing under this highway?
How was it funded?
City Walk was funded as part of the larger highway project. So that was through mostly federal funds.
I guess the IIJA came out after this was almost completed, right? So there would be no reconnecting communities funding or anything along those, because there was a lot of money in the IIJA for these types of things. Actually, initially it would have been like 20 billion and got knocked down to 1 billion. And now it's gone again. But there was money for a lot of projects like this to reconnect communities that had been ripped apart by the construction of highways back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
Yeah, no, this project was funded before that. We wanted to complete it in advance of the World Games, which were in Birmingham in 2021.
Who uses the space now?
A lot of different types of people use the space. So I have seen coaches with high school students doing football drills. I have seen people taking quinceañera photos. There's one particular spot in City Walk that's become a really popular place for taking photos. So lots of quinceañeras and wedding photos. There are greater downtown residents using the really large dog park. That was a big need. There was no dog park anywhere in greater downtown Birmingham. We've got some downtown office workers, a lot of families at the big playground. So, it's really diverse. And then on big event days, you'll see more event visitors, more people from out of town. If there's a UAB football game or a big event at the arena, that changes the makeup quite a bit. But on a normal non-event day, you'll see a lot of people from around the region on the weekends, and on weekdays, it's kind of more people from downtown and surrounding neighborhoods.
I'm also wondering, the folks who had concerns on both sides, the DOT and the local community groups, how are they feeling about the outcome?
Well, I will confess I don't have any particular insight beyond what one can read by, searching through social media and looking at press coverage. But if you look at the number of visitors and you look at the social media, it seems to be very, very positive. The skate park, definitely, lots of people taking photos at the skate park, definitely has been really well received. So, yeah, it seems like it's been very, very positive. I'd say the one challenge that has continued is not really related to use of the space. It's more about revenue development and management. It has been challenging for the Convention Center Authority to develop all the revenue that's needed to operate the space.
That's one thing that kept on popping up in my searches when I was looking at the background and research, is some of the funding shortages and troubles. And I feel like that's something that's pretty unfortunately normal with a lot of parks and recreational areas is it's hard to find funding, especially if they're not like specifically revenue generating. They can generate revenue and they generate well-being, and there's something to be said for public spaces. Basically it shouldn't have to generate revenue. It's not a business, it's a community asset. But then there is the need to pay people to do certain things. So
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that a space under a highway can't ever become a park, a formal official park. So that sometimes makes it more challenging because there is no dedicated source of funds that can be tapped into in this case. All of the public money has to be specifically appropriated for this project. And the city of Birmingham, to my knowledge, was always very, very upfront and said, we don't have enough money to pay for our existing parks. There's no way we're ever going to be able to spend $1 here. And, I am very sympathetic to that argument, especially because, to your point, I do believe this is a space that can generate some revenue through events, there is a beer garden in the space. And, if a park is going to be generating revenue, well, it's not really fair to be taking dollars away from parks that can't. Especially, parks like this in downtowns, they produce a lot of economic benefits. And so the real question is, can you capture a portion of those benefits to help operate the park? And for a variety of reasons in Birmingham, they have not been able to do that.
what do you take away from this project to your next projects?
So I actually think this is one of the more challenging under highway public spaces. Certainly it's the most challenging I've ever been involved with. I think it's one of the more challenging of any in the country because of the surrounding land uses that we mentioned, because of the history and the context of the site. So in a certain way, one of the lessons I take away, well, if this can get built, a project that is contentious, that has no real owner in a sense. The designer and I used to have a joke about this as a project that has no client, because when we were first working on it, DOT didn't want this thing. They didn't want to run it. The city didn't want to run it. Convention center didn't want to run it. So we joke we had a project without a client. And so this was a really, really challenging situation. So when I'm working in St. Petersburg, Florida right now, I'm saying, oh, this is cake compared to Birmingham. So if Birmingham can get built and Birmingham can be popular and work and attract all those people, then I think we have an opportunity to do this in places that have better foot traffic, that have better economic fundamentals, that have better surrounding land uses, that have, all kinds of things that we didn't have in Birmingham. So I'm actually optimistic about the potential for these spaces to have impacts on communities all around the country if we let them go forward.
What was surprising to you about this project? I mean, you mentioned a couple of things here, but was there anything that surprised you or like that made you kind of think this is not what I expected, but maybe is a good outcome?
One thing I was nervous about was actually dedicating as much space as we did to recreation, meaning primarily pickleball courts, because that's in this day and age a lot of what that means. But also I had mentioned like some general multi-use turf fields, and we have a couple multi-use courts. I was nervous about those spaces and whether they were going to really become dead zones. And well, not so much the pickleball courts. We knew those were going to be busy, but all the other recreational facilities, I was nervous those were going to become dead zones. And we have seen so much formal and informal use of those spaces. So that was really a really positive surprise. And, the other thing is I really have been surprised to the degree that the space has been embraced by all different segments of the Birmingham community. And something that's really cool, I didn't know that Birmingham had a small but active South Asian community. and we got a holy festival at City Walk. And that was really cool, really surprising to me also. You do these projects, you hope that people will find the space. You hope that you have designed it and created programming parameters that are flexible enough to allow for a lot of different types of activities, but also with the infrastructure to allow for specific things to happen. You plan spaces to work like that, but it doesn't always happen that way in the end. And so when you see the result and you see all of these different local community-based groups actually moving their events to the space or creating new events for the space, I mean, that's just about the best thing that you could ask for.
For sure. So what's up next for you besides the Florida project? Are there other ones that are figuring out what to do with their under highway spaces?
Yeah. So like I said, right now we just kicked off Trails Crossing Park in St. Petersburg, Florida, a couple weeks ago. And we are also working in Sacramento for the city of Sacramento on Old Sacramento, which is connected to downtown via a pedestrian tunnel that goes under a highway. You may be familiar with that one. So we're working with them to address some of that. And then we're also, I think, going to be getting started now on a project in Louisville. And that one is for a private developer looking to do sports adjacent development at their minor league baseball stadium.
Nice.
Which is next to a highway, and there is another public space opportunity underneath the highway.
Awesome. Well, where can folks find out more about what you're doing?
agorapartners.com. That's AGORA partners.com. That's our website. And I am not a real big social media guy, to be honest with you, though I am on LinkedIn, and you can find me on LinkedIn. And anybody who's listening wants to start a conversation, I am totally open to DMs and just about anything you want to talk about. Probably related to parks and public spaces, I would think. But my DMs are open on LinkedIn. And I've got a Reddit account, but I'm not going to say what that is.
Okay, that's fair. Well, it's funny. I was on Reddit and folks were posting positive things about the park.
Well, that's great. I will say I do not ever comment on my own work on Reddit.
They were really excited that on hot days, it was one of the few places downtown where they could get shade. So
there are some advantages to these spaces.
Yeah. Well, Ben, thanks for joining us. Really appreciate your time.
Hey, thanks so much, Jeff. I really appreciate the time to talk.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of the Overhead Wire and appears first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters who support this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. You can support the show as always by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Sign up for our almost 20-year-old newsletter as well by visiting theoverheadwire.com or check out the show notes for merch or other opportunities to connect. Follow along using your podcatcher of choice, but if you can't find it there, you can always find it at its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways. Hey everybody, thanks for listening this far past the credits. If you're here, I just want to say thank you to all of our generous Patreon supporters, especially those in our $10 Dallas tier and above. I just want to share their names, first names only, of course. But I figured this is long overdue that I let folks know that their support is much appreciative. Obviously, all the tiers are very appreciative, but this group has gone above and beyond over the years, and I really appreciate that. Andrew, Ben, Derek, Gabrielle, Glenn, Greg, James, Jeremy, Jim, Joseph, Catherine, Mao, Marcus, Matthew, Mike, Nicholas, Oliver, Steve, Abraham, Abby, Ed, and Matthew. We really appreciate you, and just can't say enough about how much the support from you all and everybody else on Patreon has really helped us out. So I just wanted to say a quick thank you to everybody. And yeah, so we'll see you next time.